Welcome to Crosspoint.
Welcome to Crosspoint.
Welcome to Crosspoint.
We are an inclusive faith community
seeking to live out the loving, just, and generous way of Jesus.
We are participants in a long tradition
that's less concerned with doctrines and dogma that demand total agreement,
but a life to be lived, enjoyed, and given away to others.
What unites us is a growing awareness that life is precious.
That we are made by love in order to love.
This community is comprised of and affirms the entire human family.
Regardless of race, age, creed,
physical abilities, marital or economic status,
gender identity, or sexual orientation.
So, if you're curious and have come to see,
if you are tired and have come to rest,
if you are grateful and have come to share,
if you are wounded and have come to heal,
if you're joyful and have come to celebrate,
if you are uprooted and have come to belong,
welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
We reject the art of the poor. Good morning, Crosspoint, and thanks for inviting us into your homes this morning. One of the greatest privileges of my 20 years on the job here at Crosspoint has to be the times when I've been able to help recognize and nurture musical gifts, especially in younger people. And over the years, so many have grown up and gotten involved in music. A lot of them have moved on to other places in life, but some of them are still involved at Crosspoint in music to this day, and some of them even have kids of their own now. That last song was a duet with my friend Kelsey, and it's hard for me to believe, but Kelsey was in elementary school when my wife and I moved to North Carolina and joined the Crosspoint staff. And Kelsey's voice has been for years and continues to be an integral part of what I would describe as the soundtrack to community life at Crosspoint. We're going to hear another song this morning from a new friend of mine named Sarah White. And Sarah also grew up at Crosspoint, although I didn't know her at the time. She was a teenager here at Crosspoint, but didn't publicly identify herself as a musician at the time. Sarah joined our staff last year as a graphic designer, and I found out she's also an extremely gifted singer and guitar player. And the musical onion that is Sarah keeps peeling back and showing new layers. So I want you to know that on this song that you're going to hear, Sarah mixed, produced, and recorded everything that you're going to hear, with the exception, as you'll see, of the drums, which were recorded by Dale Baker. A little bit about the song. I hadn't heard this song before. Sarah sent it to me, and along with it, she sent a note. She said, "It's kind of dark, and I don't know if it fits in church." And when I heard it, I knew what she meant, because in the American church, and especially in the segment of the church that would be described by terms like suburban, largely white, evangelical, big box megachurch, we've lost touch almost completely with a tradition that goes all the way back, predates Christianity, to Judaism, called lament. And it's there in the Psalms, the book of Psalms, alongside songs and poems of praise and thanksgiving and celebration of God are these psalms that express grief and utter pain and anger and confusion and all of the darker emotions that, for whatever reason, in church culture today, we want to pretend aren't there, at least in our music. We largely want to keep our music happy and clappy, as I call it. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to feel uplifted by music in church. If it's part of a healthy, balanced diet. But I think it's become an addiction. And what I've seen is that it subtly, when we ignore the lament, when we ignore that side of life and those emotions that we want to hide, it subtly trains us over time to do a lot of spiritual bypassing, and it's unhealthy for us. So when I heard this song, I told Sarah, it sounds to me like a modern lament psalm. And it's there in the lyrical content, but maybe even more so in the emotion that is conveyed in the music. And Sarah does a great job of conveying that emotion. So right before we hear Sarah sing the song, we're going to hear a few more words about lament from a biblical scholar named Walter Brueggemann, who's done a ton of work on the Psalms.
Praise hymns are so bloodless and innocuous, and I think they are exercises in denial. I think eventually you get to praise, but as you know, in the book of Psalms, you do the lament, and then you come at the end of the psalm, you come to praise, but you don't start there. You never start there, and. In the more liturgical churches, I don't know if this is true in evangelical churches, but my gripe about liturgical churches is you always begin with a confession of sin. Well, most of these lament psalms, there's nothing about guilt in them. And you're not going to pin this problem on me. So I think the pastoral work has to do with entitling and empowering people to make a case in the presence of God for the legitimacy of their own life. And all kinds of artistry, I think, is important to do that. And that, for people who are conventional about that, all of that obviously feels like blasphemy. That's why I say the first audience are the most wounded, because the most wounded have this sneaking suspicion, we do have to say that. So I would imagine that in any congregation, you probably got the people that need to do this, and you got the silencers. But more than that, I suspect in the life of an individual believer, this same tension is operating, because my mother always washed my mouth out if I talked poorly or badly. But I have to. And then you have to negotiate how much of this you can say and all of that. And so I think that these Psalms, they become a script for learning how to speak what we have to say that we were never permitted to say. And then I think all kinds of artistry can do the same thing. But until the hurt or the pain is made available to people, then we can just go on our way with denial, and everything is just fine.
Yeah, Lord, you know I'm tired. Yeah, Lord, you know I'm tired. Yeah, Lord, you know I'm tired of tears. Yeah, Lord, just cut me loose. Yeah, Lord, you know I'm fighting. Yeah, Lord, you know I'm fighting. I'm sure this world is done with me. Yeah, Lord, you know it's true. Now the tide is rolling in. I don't wanna wait.
There are many ways we collaborate with each other to be the church we're called to be and to serve how we serve. And our contributing financially is one of the most important of those ways. If you want to help fund and sustain what we get to do together, go to crosspoint.org/contribute to see the many simple ways that you can do so. You can even text crosspointenc to 77977 to receive a link to get started now. Thank you for your partnership in the work we do together.
Hello, my friends. Glad to be with you today. I want to start with a reminder that after 2 years, Sunday, March 13th, we're going to be meeting in person back in the building for service, under a roof and everything, which is exciting. And I know that comes with questions that you're going to have. We're going to have a lot more detail to share as we get closer, details about what to expect. All the things that are going to be like they were in many respects. Also, some big changes that there's going to be compared to how it was a few years ago. So I just want to make sure for now that you have it on your calendar if you're able and intend to go. If not, by the way, if your preference is tuning in right here like you have been doing on Sundays, that's fine too. This format will continue to be offered in the exact same way. Not a recording of the in-person gathering. We're going to put this out, this online service together like we have been doing in this format, and then our in-person gatherings starting March 13th, those are going to be put together as a whole other thing. So mark your calendars or type it into your calendar, put a string on your finger. However you want to remember not to forget. We are looking forward to seeing you on March 13th. Okay, so today we're going to be in the Gospel of Luke, the 4th chapter. And in Luke chapter 4, Jesus is faced with 40 days of fasting in the wilderness and the 3 temptations. And then right after these 3 temptations, you could almost argue that there's a 4th temptation. The 4th temptation is one we all know super well. It's the urge to shift or change your messaging so that your audience will more readily accept it. And of course, you as the messenger. So right after Jesus comes out of the wilderness and gets a much needed bite to eat, we come to the 16th verse of Luke chapter 4, where it reads, "When Jesus came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written." Now, before we go on from there and read what he read, Jesus is back home in Nazareth. This is where he was raised. And he's chosen to do the day's reading in the synagogue. So he unrolls the scroll to the place where the reading, that day's reading is found. And you have to remember there's no chapters, there's no verses, there aren't even pages. It's just one long scroll. The Isaiah scroll is about 25 feet long. And you have to know how many times to turn the poles to get to the place you're reading. So this moment is maybe a little dramatic as Jesus is standing there turning these poles until he lands on today's reading. And then he quotes it as Luke continues. He says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Okay, so let's note that in this moment, Jesus is reading this passage. It's already about 7.5 centuries old. This is already an ancient sacred text by Jesus' day, and so Jews knew this text inside and out. So this audience is immediately aware that Jesus is getting it wrong. Jesus is misquoting it. Isaiah 61 is a favorite because there are several references to Israel reclaiming its honor, about Israel being rebuilt into a powerful presence in the world, about strangers from other lands being forced into servitude to them, that God is going to provide these things. Nazareth, as a town, has a ton of archaeological scholarship aimed at it now. And many historians describe Nazareth in Jesus' day as this small, relatively young city that had become a Jewish settlement. When many Jews who had no land, they began moving north from Jerusalem and taking land from others, from Gentiles. So by moving into these lands, conflict followed. Of course it did. We can easily imagine Nazareth being taken by these Jewish settlers by way of something like manifest destiny, which leads to conflict and violence with those who already live there. So Nazareth is this little town on the front edge of an expansion, on the front lines in some respects. By Jesus' day and after, Nazareth is also home to a ton of priestly families. So as we consider the context, a town like Nazareth with these circumstances would have necessarily been very religiously conservative by way of its priests, all the priests that lived there, very nationalistic by way of its still fresh and fragile history of its settlers, very much identifying themselves by their opposition to those they had driven off the land. And so let's hold all this in mind, the tension, the nationalism, the religiosity, the self-centering that were likely part of the culture there in Jesus' hometown, and consider Jesus then goes here to this conservative settler community, waving at all the people he knew better than he knew people anywhere else. He heads right to its synagogue, and he reads one of their favorite passages about God rebuilding and reestablishing Zion for the Jews, at the expense even of foreigners. So here's the passage he's quoting from, but this time I'm going to read it directly from Isaiah 61. It reads, "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to grant those who mourn in Zion, to give them a beautiful headdress instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of a faint spirit, that they may be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. They shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations." You can see why it's a favorite. God is really going to take Israel back to its former glory. And I don't want to belabor the text, but let's experience Jesus quoting and frankly misquoting this passage through the lens of a people who just know God is on our side. He's the captain of our team. He's going to rebuild our ruins, raise up our former devastations, bring our morality back, mend our broken hearts, make those foreigners our servants if they get to be around us at all. So watch what he does. In Luke's account, Jesus is reading Isaiah 61 like this: "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me," Messiah'd me, almost literally, Messiah'd me, "to bring good news to the poor." Then he leaves out, "He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives." Then he adds in from somewhere else, "and recovery of sight to the blind." Then he omits the thing about opening of the prison to those who are bound, but leaves in, "to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And then edits out the last parts of the stanza where it says the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to grant to those who mourn in Zion. He takes all that out. So rabbis did this. Rabbis would add and omit and massage scripture here and there to make a point. But Jesus really goes for it. He edits out all the stuff about a return to great political and economic prosperity for Israel. But he leaves the part about the poor receiving good news. He seems to take out the stuff where the audience could understand their own brokenheartedness, being God's focus. He takes that part completely out. He talks about being set free, but he omits mention of opening prisons, almost as if he's implying his audience is going to be stuck in another definition of being unfree, apart from prisons, another kind of being trapped. Then he shimmies in some new sentence about the blind being made able to see, which was very likely insulting to an audience that thought they were the only ones that could see. You know, they're the only ones that can recognize the truth and how especially important that was with all the surrounding godlessness. And then Jesus leaves in the phrase that implies he's announcing the year of the Lord's favor. This is from the book of Leviticus, chapter 25. He's referring to the year of Jubilee. This happens every 50 years, where all the debts would be canceled, all the slaves are freed, all the land given back to whoever the land had been taken from. So he leaves that part in, and once he says this, then he stops, and he completely omits the next part that talks about God's vengeance, God comforting our broken hearts. Leaves all of that rebuilding language out, all of it. Now, we do have to synthesize a lot of context from the time and the place. We're doing some speculating. We can't be 100% sure of all this. But I want to look at the next verses because there's a really peculiar reaction that everybody has to Jesus' reading. It says he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. Then the eyes of everybody in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say, "Today, the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." The thing you've been waiting for is happening right in front of you. All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, "Isn't this Joseph's son?" Now, this last part is confusing, and you'll see why in a second. It says that when he's done, they spoke well of him. So it sounds like they all are smiling, and they're like, "Amen, not bad for the carpenter's son. This is Joseph's boy. That's good. That's a good sermon." As I've learned over and over, ancient Greek is really tricky to translate into English. The phrase in English, "they spoke well of him," literally translated from the Greek is "they witnessed him." It's actually neither positive or negative as a review. So with the rest of the context, it seems far more likely that they witnessed against him. It was negative because Jesus just altered one of their favorite passages and made it sound like, get this, maybe God isn't only on our side, and maybe what God is doing and will be doing is not only just about us. Maybe what God is doing will be good for everybody. So when they say, "Isn't this Joseph's son?" they're saying, didn't he grow up here? Isn't he one of us? He grew up down the street. Who does he think he is? Uncentering his own people, changing the clear sense of the Bible, disrespecting his own tradition, and painting God so gracious and kind toward those that we know are wrong. They live in sin. They're wrong about everything. You ever notice how God is allowed to be big enough to create the universe and the sun and Jupiter and the Crab Nebula? But God's not big enough to contradict the parameters we have. He's not allowed to be good to those we don't like. It's like we want God to be a Great Dane, huge and loud and awe-inducing and can protect us, but ours, happy to be on our leash. So Jesus teaches, these reviews immediately come in, that Jesus is way too progressive, too theologically liberal. And it's a shame too, because he grew up here and he should be thankful, but Joseph's boy, he's a backslider. He doesn't take the Bible seriously, Then Jesus continues. He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself. You're the one who's sick.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things that we heard that you did in Capernaum,'" this nearby fishing town. And Jesus said, "Truly I tell you the truth. No prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown." Which is true. They knew it. We all know that that's true. Prophets can only be celebrated after they're dead. But while they're alive, we despise them for having the audacity to demand a better world and saying that we might be the problem. A really helpful modern reminder, especially this February, is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. He's going to be quoted and memed and appealed to by every pastor and politician this month. In fact, I'm going to close this whole message with one of my favorite MLK quotes. A Gallup poll in 1966 showed that 63% of the respondents rated Martin Luther King Jr. as an entirely unfavorable human being. They called him highly divisive, wrong-headed. MLK was killed while being ranked by most people as a nuisance. And a poll a few years before that ranked him as the second least respected American. Only later can a prophet become the hero, because we're incredibly slow learners. Plus, it's harder for them to confront us in our narrowness, after they're gone. Then we're fine with them. So Jesus continues in verse 25. The truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, referencing hundreds of years earlier. When heaven was shut up for 3 years and 6 months and there was a severe famine all over the land, yet Elijah was sent to none of them except to a widow at Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman, the Syrian. So you see how Jesus starts that part with, he's telling two well-known Bible stories where God only helped outsiders and didn't help those who thought God was, exclusively theirs, on their leash. And then he says, but the truth is. Before recounting those well-known stories, he says, but the truth is, as if to say, look, this is nothing new. You've seen this. You're supposed to know this. What the Spirit is up to isn't exclusive or even local, and it never has been. God has never belonged to you. When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of town, led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. Jesus teaches this text in a really fascinating way. He plays with it in a really fascinating way. He wields it almost in a way to force self-evaluation, or in the very least reveal the resistance to self-evaluation. And they instantly resent him for it. They're enraged. So given the choice to see God more expansively and the Spirit inviting them into wider vistas, they detonate and resort to violence. And we should note there's no record of Jesus ever going back to Nazareth. That's it. So, think about that. They were attempting not so much to sacrifice the Messiah too early. They were trying to kill the neighbor boy for making goodness and love universal. And so Jesus sort of says, fine, have your village all to yourselves. And he never goes back. I spoke to my daughter 4 days ago, and she was telling me about some new employees at her office. She's responsible for training them. And during the training, she was made aware that there's changes in the pay structure for new employees. And they're changes from what my daughter was making when she was new. They're going to be paid a lot more. And she said, Dad, they're going to be making significantly more an hour than I was making just 2 years ago. Then she said, part of me feels like, okay, good for them. But there's this other part of me that feels frustrated about it. Like, how are they going to be making that much money from day one before they've had to do anything or spend any time here? So we talked about that some. And I understood it, and I offered a slightly different perspective where she could be proud of her company for paying a much higher wage that could actually maybe be livable. A lot of companies, they only let those at the very top enjoy a good income. But her company was maybe starting to do a better job paying their employees, all of their employees, a stronger wage. So, she said, wow, yeah, that's a helpful perspective. You're the best dad on earth, something like that. So the next day we talked about it again. And she, as we were talking about it, she got this surprise swell of emotion. And she said, I'm a little embarrassed about my take on all this and a little ashamed. And she said it was because she felt jealousy that these new people could so quickly achieve what took her years to do. And she's so great at articulating her feelings. And she goes, I felt like by getting that hourly wage on their first day that they were taking something from me. And we just sat with that for a minute because I'm 100% capable of that exact same sentiment. I have a friend who recently told me that there's this other person that has been a real idiot toward him. And this guy hadn't meant to be an idiot, but intention only has so much control over outcome. But my friend, after explaining this insult this guy had leveled at him, on purpose or not, he said that he wanted to find a way to be kind and understanding to him, to do him some good. And I was aware that there's this little voice in my head that recoiled at that. Here's what it was. It wasn't this voice saying, no, do him dirty, get your revenge. It was the fact that my friend is also very kind to me. He's always the most kind and supportive and loving person toward me. And so the little voice was saying, if he's kind to that guy, that idiot, then my friend is kind to everyone. He's not being kind to me because I'm special or because I've earned it. He's being kind to me and that idiot because my friend is kind. I didn't like it. Part of me didn't like it. You see how that works? The voice in my head felt like goodness is this limited thing that has to be earned. And as soon as it started to look like it wasn't limited, but was available to, oh my gosh, everybody, I felt threatened. Maybe you can relate. That feeling that you want others to do well, fine, just not quite as well as you. The feeling where you want equality, yes, of course, just maybe you could have a little more equality than others. That feeling where you love to live in the beauty of kindness and forgiveness and grace. But really, it'd be nice if everybody else lived by karma. What is it that makes something valuable? Isn't it scarcity? I mean, don't we all understand one of a kind means expensive, and over 1 million printed means, I'll find one at Goodwill for a nickel. So when things like love and grace and inclusion, they prove readily available to even them, it's almost like property values are plummeting. Exclusivity is the best part of it. It's being ruined by its ubiquity, by its availability. What's the point in getting involved in the market of God if it's not competitive? And Jesus' fellow Nazarenes wanted what we all want if we're not awake to the kindness and the mercy and the justice of God. But the truth is, those who think that God agrees with their who's in and who's out, they're often the very ones who stay unwell, even in the presence of the healer. The truth is that those of us who use our Bibles and our positions of power to reinforce the lie of scarcity, exclusivity, who reinforce the lie that God is tribal and small, ours, because we came to the right conclusions, the truth is, those are the very ones who live a very threatened life, constantly in a defensive posture, know nothing of peace. They're often the ones who sing of freedom and grace, but they're always threatened by others. They're threatened by new ideas, threatened by different conclusions, threatened by including people who'd previously been excluded. The truth is, those of us who think of ourselves as the center, that we've earned this place in the center, we'll even feel threatened when we have to examine the problems of our own history. But let's remember, what our egos get defensive about and feel threatened by, our truer selves know is actually very good. Because our truer selves know that oneness is where this is all headed, because oneness is the truth. Okay, now, you'd expect that after his own people tried to murder him by trying to throw him off a cliff, Jesus would be like, I'm just going to wash my hands of this whole thing. I'm going to get more into woodworking or something. Maybe I'm projecting. But the very next verse shows Jesus going to Capernaum, that fishing town. He goes right to Capernaum's synagogue, and he's right back to speaking at another gathering of his own fellow faithful. And after that, he does it again. He continues to do this very thing week after week after week. Why? Because he's not trying to make people angry. He's trying to wake them up. He's not trying to provoke these people to rage, which is a constriction. He's trying to allow their hearts to expand, their minds to expand, to an expansion. He's not trying to shame anybody. He's trying to jolt them open to a faith that's bigger than denominations or political rhetoric or political brands or personal preferences and all that. A faith that can open its eyes to see siblings where before you saw enemies or objects of hatred or competitors. Once we start to see that our separations are very convincing illusions, but they're illusions, we begin to see that what Jesus was showing his contemporaries is that if something lifts up others, it lifts up me. If something's good for others, it's good for me. If something drags down my neighbor, then I'm being dragged down too. And the deepest part of us knows this. But the rest of us, the other parts of us, we resist it. And I'm faced with this resistance all the time. I get asked, why do you have to shove inclusion and justice down our throats all the time? I mean, I get your point, but how come we have to talk about it over and over and over? Why don't you talk about the gospel? But you pound on everybody with social justice stuff every week. Oftentimes people say, I agree with what you're saying, but why do we have to be constantly browbeaten with equality and justice? So please hear me on this. I get it. I'll stop when I sense both that I finally understand all this, and I sense that the spirit of justice and mercy and kindness is finally telling me, okay, we're good. Everybody's equal. Everybody can see each other and their experiences as they really are. Once that stuff happens, I'll change topics. The favorable year of the Lord, the blessing of all human beings, the universal grace of God, the love of enemies, justice, mercy, the expansive inclusion of the so-called outsider, to keep these at the fore, that's only a browbeating when we position ourselves against it. The redeeming of the world and its people, the work of two becoming one, that's only something that can do me harm if I benefit from imbalance, or I can be blessed by not talking about it. I'm unaffected by silence. It's always going to be difficult for our minds to celebrate God's universality, but the fundamental equality we have as human siblings that exists under these painful illusions that we've set up, we have to expose those lies. The grace that includes me is the grace that includes all of us, every single one of us, or it's not grace. This is true in how we think of God and theology and faith. It's true about how we think about our day-to-day lives, our ability for somebody to earn a good wage and to be able to vote and to have a chance to live in a house. It's true in how we protect each other or confront each other, based on, vulnerability or silly distributions of power and wealth. It's true in church. It's true between churches. It's true at school, at work. What the Spirit is up to, she is up to in every part of our lives, not just one part. Oneness is the truth. Oneness is where this is all going. And so, as we close, I want to ponder the words of Dr. King from his letter from the Birmingham jail. And of course, they've got a very precise and important context that should be understood first. But what he says also is timeless and I think true in all contexts. So let's consider his words not simply for their being poetic or anything, but for them being hard and beautiful and for them being saving extensions of Jesus' own words to his fellow Nazarenes. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. What affects one directly affects all indirectly.
Thank you for joining us today, and welcome home. If you are in need of assistance during this crisis, please reach out at crosspoint.org/help.